Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the first MTA webinar of 2023. My name is Catherine Barker. I'm the President-elect of the Music Teachers Association, and I'm really pleased that you've been able to join us this evening for this webinar, where we're really pleased that we've been joined by Christopher Stevens, who is the Specialist Advisor for Ofsted and the National Lead for Music. He's going to be talking to us about assessment and all things to do with music education and linking to the inspection framework and the Ofsted research review, and trying to put lots of examples into that work, which can really help to bring it to life for those of us who are working in schools day in, day out. Chris himself has a background as a music teacher, of course, and as a leader of music and a senior leader in schools and a system leader of schools, and visits schools every week, both in a music capacity and also in inspection, and has vast experience of the school system. So it's really exciting that we can have him here to talk to all of you today. So over to you, Chris. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Catherine, and a very good evening to you all. Thank you very much for the invite to come and talk to you all this evening. So I'm going to be talking about assessment with you today, and really sharing with you what does inspection evidence and research tell us are likely to be the most effective approaches to assessment in music. That's what we'll talk about this afternoon, and happy to take questions at the end of the presentation today. Now, the content that I'm sharing with you today, much of it is taken from our research review that was published about 16 months ago. So if there's something that particularly catches your interest, or there's something that you want to revisit following this presentation today, I'd point you in the direction of that document, which is freely available on the internet. Now, about a year ago, probably about 14 months ago, I think, Mark Phillips, my predecessor, gave a presentation about the curriculum in music. And the presentation he gave to this group was called Music, Not Just a Series of Activities, the Importance of the Music Curriculum. And in that presentation, Mark explained the importance of ensuring that the curriculum is deliberately and incrementally builds pupils' knowledge and skills over time, so that pupils become more musical. And he made the point in that presentation that the music curriculum shouldn't just be a series of activities, but rather it should be a deliberate set of content and knowledge that is deliberately designed to incrementally build pupils' musical knowledge and skills, so that they become more musical. And by that we mean better performers. You know, they can control sound better, they're more sophisticated composers and more nuanced in their ability to listen. So the curriculum, he talked about being a series of content that incrementally and purposely builds pupils' musical knowledge. And this evening, the presentation I'm going to give on assessment directly links or builds on that key message from Mark just over a year ago. In a sense, assessment and the curriculum need to be highly calibrated. More on that a little bit later on. Assessment at its heart, the theme for this programme this evening, is about checking that the curriculum content in your curriculum, and the reason I say your curriculum is your music curriculum is likely to look very different perhaps to somebody else's. Assessment, at the heart of assessment, is about checking whether that curriculum content is being learned by pupils. Hence why I said that assessment and the curriculum need to be calibrated. And I think on a broader point, just before we get going, just to say this, and there may well be questions about this at the end, but I often asked about what does it mean to make progress? Well, if we think about it, if the curriculum, as Mark had suggested, is about children incrementally learning content over time to become more musical. If children are learning your curriculum and they're remembering your curriculum, they will be making progress because they will be learning the content that is set out in your journey, in your curriculum journey. Before I get going this evening, though, in terms of the examples I'm going to share with you, I just want to say, I always say this, but it is certainly meant to be reassuring. The examples I give, Ofsted does not expect schools to replicate. What I'm trying to do through my examples, subject-specific examples, is bring some broader principles to life. So we certainly don't expect them to be replicated. And secondly, there'll be some language that I use that I'll explain as I go along. But again, we don't expect schools to replicate that language. It's just the language that we use in some of our literature. So hopefully that's reassuring. Now, before we turn to schools and turn to music in schools, I want us to just think about what the school inspection handbook says about what inspectors will do on inspection when they look at assessment. Because as you know, and I've spoken to a fair few of these now, I always say that when we come to inspect, we inspect schools, we inspect the quality of education in the school. What we don't do is inspect individual subjects. So I think a really good place for us to start is to think about, well, what does the school inspection handbook, the sort of guidance for inspectors, say they will do when they look at assessment in schools? We'll then translate some of those principles into what that means in the music classroom. So let's start with this handbook then. And this is paragraph 212 in the school inspection handbook, and it says that inspectors will consider how the curriculum that's either being developed by the school or adopted by the school is taught and assessed. And this is the really interesting bit, and it goes on to say, in order to support pupils to build their knowledge, in order to help pupils, if you like, learn the curriculum. So that's the first thing inspectors will do. They will want to consider how well assessment is used to help pupils learn the curriculum. The second thing that the inspection handbook talks about is that inspectors will consider whether assessment focuses on the most important knowledge and concepts or skills that pupils need to know in order to learn the curriculum. So this is about whether assessment focuses on the right things to help pupils learn the curriculum. That's the second thing inspectors will look at. And the third thing that inspectors will consider is how well teachers use assessment to check whether pupils are learning the curriculum so that they inform or so that they adapt their own teaching. So how well is assessment used to identify gaps in pupils' knowledge and to inform teaching, to change teaching? So in summary, our inspection handbook says in terms of assessment, we'll look at three things. One, how well assessment is used to support pupils to learn the curriculum. Two, how well does assessment focus on the right things, the things that children really need to learn in order to make progress? And just to go back to that idea of progress, progress is about remembering the curriculum in your school. And thirdly, how well assessment is used to check pupils' understanding and how well teachers use this information to adapt and inform their own teaching. So that's the broad principles of what inspectors will look at when they look at the quality of education in schools. So what does this all mean in the context of music teaching? Now, this is the part where I am going to use some musical examples to bring things to life. And as I said at the start, certainly don't expect schools to replicate these. They're simply there to illustrate some broader points. And the first thing I want to talk to you about in assessment is the kind of assessment that our research evidence says is the most useful kind of assessment in music. And that is the kind of assessment that you as musicians will all be familiar with. And that is ongoing assessment, a sort of behavior in the classroom that teachers do or musicians do, providing feedback as part of the ongoing learning process. And I like here to use the example because I think it illustrates a number of points really of the conductor in front of the orchestra. If you think about the conductor in front of the orchestra, one of their jobs is to provide in the moment feedback to the musicians in that group. And they will be providing feedback on a whole raft of things, technical aspects of the music, for example, how things might be, for example, being bowed, or they might be providing feedback on how the music's being interpreted. They might be providing advice and guidance on how they want that to be done differently. That conductor is providing the kind of assessment I'm talking about, ongoing feedback and assessment in the moment. And of course, what they're doing is they're using their ears, their listening skills to listen really carefully to what's happening and then providing feedback to those musicians in the moment. And this kind of formative if you like, or developmental assessment is the assessment which our research review says is by far the most useful kind of assessment in music, far more useful than summative, and we'll come on to that later. This ongoing dialogue with pupils, this ongoing assessment and feedback. Now, I want to provide to you an example of a part of a curriculum in a primary school, and I want to link the curriculum with the way assessment was being used and the kind of formative assessment that was going on in this school. You know, at the start of this presentation, I said that assessment should be highly calibrated with the curriculum. And I'm hoping this next example will show you what I mean by that the assessment and the curriculum in this school were calibrated, were very, very closely linked. Now, this slide's particularly busy, and I don't really at the moment want you to take much notice about that, because I'd just like to explain to you the context of this school. This was a school, primary school, where the leaders had decided that the aim of their curriculum, or one of the aims of their curriculum, was by the time the children left year 6, the end of Key Stage 2, they wanted the children in this school to be able to play the guitar with a basic level of competence. And what they meant by that is that they wanted the children to be able to play almost intuitively, automatically, about 8 chords on the guitar. They wanted them to be able to play those accurately, fluently. They wanted them to be able to strum, because ultimately what they wanted them to do was to pick up a piece of music or a score with some tablature and be able to provide a musical accompaniment to that using a variety of strumming patterns and their knowledge of chords. That's where they wanted the children to be by the end of year 6. That was their end point, if you like, their ambitious end point. That's what they wanted to achieve. And what they went about doing is breaking down that endpoint, if you like, a composite skill. Now, this is the word you may or may not use, but that idea that that guitar performance is composite because it's a combination of lots of different little building blocks that children would need to learn, lots of different skills that they need to learn along the way in order to build that composite skill. And they thought about this in their curriculum right back to year 3, because they started this journey on the guitar in year 3, moving all the way through to year 6. And interestingly, in year 3, in this particular school, they decided that they were going to introduce this to children on the ukulele, and they made that decision for a number of reasons. And in term 1 of playing the ukulele in year 3, they had set out some things that they knew in their curriculum children had to learn if they were going to be successful in the long run. So if you take my idea here of the Jenga tower, and I'll come to these in a second, at the end of this Jenga tower is this idea, this composite skill that they want children to be able to play the guitar with some competence. They'd started to think about all the little building blocks that children were going to need to learn in order to secure this endpoint that they'd set out. And clearly, in their curriculum, these building blocks would be different to, say, your curriculum, because the endpoint would be different. And in term 1 of picking up the ukulele, the teachers explained to me that there were some things, some components, some little building blocks that they absolutely needed children to know and be secure in if they were going to continue this musical journey. And they were simply being able to collect the instrument safely, knowing how to hold the ukulele correctly. They knew that the children had to be able to play the correct strings when holding the ukulele correctly to a steady pulse. They wanted children to know the fret numbers and to be able to locate them. And by the end of term 1 at Christmas, they wanted the children to be able to play a C and an A minor chord with the correct fingers, thumb position and hand position. These were the components that they absolutely needed children to know at this stage of their curriculum. And interestingly, this is what their assessment focused on. I mentioned at the start the assessment being calibrated to the curriculum. This was the content they needed to learn, and it was this content that the teachers were checking in the moment as that curriculum was being delivered. And the assessment that took place, very much like that conductor in the moment, most of that assessment was in the moment feedback, which was of this, what I would call the error kind of feedback. No, you're not playing that quite right, do it like this. You're not holding it, let me show you how to do it. That ongoing feedback on those component levels. And the feedback was at the component level rather than the composite level. So what on earth do I mean by that? So the nature of the feedback was, James, for example, look at me, that's where your finger needs to go. I'll show you that now. You copy me, you do that. As opposed to saying at the composite level, James, you need to go and work on your chord playing. You need to be more accurate. This was really detailed, finite feedback at the component level. And the point I'm trying to make here, 2 points. One, in this particular school, the assessment was very closely aligned to what they needed children to learn. Do you know, when we went back at the start of this presentation, I talked about one of the things assessment that Ofsted will look at is, does assessment focus on the things children really need to learn? Well, in this school, this is what, in this term, teachers and leaders felt children needed to secure in order to continue their musical journey. And the second point I want to make to you is that this real clear articulation of the components, of the bits that children need to learn in the school curriculum, was really helping the teachers, and particularly those that were not specialists, to make sure that their feedback, their in the moment feedback, was focusing on the right things. Now, the third point I'd like to make, and it comes back to a broader point about becoming more musical, was this wasn't just some technical exercise. The reason the teachers were focusing these things was they knew they had to get this right in order to produce a nice and a quality sound in terms of later when you're thinking about playing expressively on these instruments. So the clear articulation of these components in the curriculum really helped the teachers to focus their feedback, particularly those who weren't specialists, on the right things to help pupils learn. Now, some broader points to do with formative assessment that I think would be helpful, that our research and inspection insights tell us, is that in music, it's okay sometimes if children don't know something about a topic or they don't know how to do something, they don't need feedback. They just need to be shown how to do it. And that's perfectly okay. If you've got, for example, a child at the very early stages, and let's face it, many of the children that we'll be teaching will be novices when it comes to music, and they're trying to play a C major scale and they don't know where the C is on the keyboard, then we show them, we demonstrate to them. That's part of our modeling as a musician. And the third point I want to make here, and this is a really important one, and it is mentioned in our research review, the point about this kind of formative feedback is that it should require the pupil to do more work than the teacher. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is extensive and unnecessary written feedback or written recordings of oral feedback by teachers is not necessary. Better to provide a quick musical demonstration for the pupil to respond to in the moment, rather than unnecessarily writing things down or providing written feedback. And I want to make this absolutely clear, and it says this in our handbook. Ofsted does not require schools to provide written evidence of oral feedback to pupils. In fact, our view is actually that's not good use of assessment, because it detracts the teacher from being able to provide feedback in the moment, which we know is the thing that's going to help children improve their musical outcomes. There is absolutely no expectation that teachers should do that. Quite the opposite. We expect teachers to be able to provide feedback that's going to help children in the moment, and unnecessary and extensive written feedback can slow that process down, as well as creating workload for teachers. So there's some things there about formative assessment. One, the idea that having a clear conception of what needs to be learnt, what quality sounds like, can support the teachers in providing feedback. Secondly, feedback and demonstration is part of an ongoing behaviour, is the sort of assessment that we think is really helpful in music lessons. And thirdly, we do not expect that oral feedback or musical demonstrations need to be notated, written down, and provided in written feedback. And we're really, really clear about that. So I finally just want to move on to the use of summative assessment in music. So we've talked about the kind of ongoing assessment as a behaviour in the music classroom. What does our research evidence then say about the use of summative assessment in music? Now, by summative assessment, I think helpful here to explain my understanding of this, I mean an assessment that does not take place as part of an ongoing lesson by lesson kind of assessment. I'm talking about the kind of assessment which involves stopping learning and then doing some sort of assessment activity. So typically that might look like a mock exam, or in terms of Key Stage 3, that might be for some schools a termly assessment where the teaching stops and then there's an assessment lesson or an assessment couple of lessons. So what's the purpose of this kind of assessment in music? Well, one of the purposes of this kind of assessment is to allow teachers and school leaders to judge whether the whole curriculum is working. Let me give you an example. In that school I talked about with the ukuleles and the guitars, they did this kind of assessment once a year. That's when they did it. And at the end of the year, the children from year 3 would play in an ensemble, would play their ukuleles, and they'd be given a piece in smaller groups to perform. And that piece was designed to check whether they were reading the tab, whether they could play certain chords that they'd learned. It was carefully designed, and the children were given an opportunity to learn that and then to perform it. In that particular school, the leaders recorded that using video recording and then made a recording of those, were able to sit and look at those recordings and say, is our curriculum working? By this stage, are the children able to do what we thought they should be able to do in terms of our curriculum? And leaders were telling me the first couple of times they did that, the children weren't. They weren't confident in some of the chords. They weren't confident in some of the technical aspects. So they went back and they revisited that, and they redeveloped or redesigned their curriculum in response to that summative assessment. So that was assessment being used to check the whole curriculum effectiveness, so that teachers and leaders could identify gaps, misconceptions, and potentially amend the curriculum for future years. And I want to stress that checking pupils are learning the knowledge and skills within that curriculum. You can see again how it's calibrated to the curriculum in that particular school. Which brings me to a point, I think it's a really interesting point to consider when we think about summative assessment in music. And that is that there are no universal features of music that allow an assessment of attainment in the domain as a whole. So what I mean by that is there is no assessment out there that can give us a judgment of musicality, a whole rounded judgment of how good somebody is at music. The very nature of our subject means that our assessments will be checking whether we've learnt the things within our curriculum. Let me give you an example of that. You know, if you go in and you do a grade exam in the piano, that assessment within that grade 1 or grade 2 piano assessment is checking some very specific things on that instrument. Do you know those scales on that instrument? Are you able to play those particular pieces? What we can't do from that is extrapolate an assessment about somebody's musicality overall. And that's really worth thinking about when you're designing assessments in your school. Is your assessment checking that your curriculum has been learnt? Or is it trying to do something else? Is it trying to provide an overall grade for music, say at Key Stage 3, and I just say our research says, actually, that's unlikely to be helpful. Better to focus on what you want your children to learn and whether that's being successful. And the second point I want to make on this, and we're clear in the research review about it, is that in order to get better at music, it takes time. Now, we know this as musicians, but if a school, for example, wanted to evidence or report on progress every term in music, let's take a secondary school, that could potentially mean having an assessment every 5 to 10 hours of learning in music. Compare that to the same, say, subject like maths, where they'd have 40 hours. Now, the question here is it really realistic that children will have made that much progress in 5 to 10 hours? If we think about those children learning the ukulele right through to the guitar, this was a curriculum running for 4 years. So there's a question there about how frequent this kind of summative assessment should be. And the reason that that's a really important thing to debate and to discuss is that there's a danger that if assessment of this kind is too frequent, actually the assessment drives the curriculum. So the curriculum becomes about preparing for these assessments rather than the assessment checking whether your long-term curriculum is working. And I think that is a real challenge to think about how frequent should this kind of summative assessment be in music. Yes, there can be ongoing assessment checks, of course, but this kind of assessment where we stand back needs to be infrequent. It doesn't need to happen very often because we know it takes time to make progress in music and to learn the curriculum. So that brings me, in summary, to the end of the presentation today. And shortly, I'm quite happy to take questions. But I just want to summarise some of the things that I've said to you about assessment. The first thing, I hope it's come across really clearly in this presentation today, that the assessment is highly calibrated to the curriculum content within your school. And going right back to the presentation Mark gave about 14 months ago, that curriculum should set out the knowledge and skills that children need to learn incrementally to get better at music. If children are learning that knowledge, they will be making musical progress because they'll be learning and remembering your curriculum. Second thing I'd like to say to you that our research evidence and inspection insights tell us that the best kind of assessment, the most useful kind of assessment in music is that formative, ongoing assessment as a behaviour that we are all so familiar with as musicians. And that the clarity over the components which form the basis for this, being really clear, like that example I gave to you in the school with the ukulele, being really clear about what children need to secure and know, having real clarity over that can help teachers provide feedback on the right things, the things that are important for children to make progress through your curriculum. And finally, I've made the point that summative assessment should be used judiciously, infrequently, and the purpose of that is to check on whether the curriculum as a whole is working. Is the curriculum that you set out doing what you want it to do?
That brings me towards, I think, the conclusion of the session this evening. Before I hand over to Jill, who's going to kind of wrap up with some general MTA information, I wanted to thank you, Chris, for joining us. I would very much like to invite you back to do another session on breadth and depth. It's great to have that, to have you with us, and also thank you to everybody who joined. 5 to 6 on a Tuesday in a very bleak January is good going, and to those who watch back as well. I'm not sure if this bit will be included in the recording, but thank you as well. Every school is blessed to have a music teacher who really goes the extra mile to find out and to get involved, and so they have a better experience for children and young people. That's what we're all about, and it's great to have you with us. So
well, just echo
much, Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine, for having me. Just to echo your thanks for what people are doing. One of the things I know from the research reviews, the impact of COVID on music teachers and departments is tough. It still is tough. So just a big thank you. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for the questions, and nice to meet you and nice to speak to everybody. Thank you very much, Catherine.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
And I will hand over to Jill, huge thanks to Jill, who makes everything happen in the background. We really couldn't do this without you, Jill. And if you can tell everyone a bit more about the MTA.
Of course. Thank you for that introduction, Catherine. And for those of you who haven't met me, I'm Jill Davis, the Conference and Events Manager. I'll keep this very brief, but just wanted to jump in because some of you may not have heard of the MTA before or may not have joined our sessions before. We're a membership organisation. We have 1,000 members who are just like you. They're music teachers up and down the country. And we're here run by teachers to support teachers. There's many ways you can get involved that don't cost you anything, which include our fantastic podcast run by Patrick Johns that you may have listened to before. We have online CPD, some of which is open to non-members as well as members. If you do want to become a member, then you have access to our e-bulletins, our magazine, the opportunity to join our conference, which I'm busy organising at the moment and is running from the 12th to the 14th of May in Loughborough Schools Foundation. So we're very excited about that. You also have access to the Facebook staff room, which is a smaller group than our main Facebook page and a really safe place where you can invite questions or just talk to all of your contemporaries and feel supported by the network of teachers across the country. So do get involved, and just to note, it's also completely free for trainees and early career teachers in their first year of teaching. So it's an absolute no-brainer if you're starting out in your career and you want to feel supported. And that's it from us. Thank you very much for joining this evening.